Welcome to Word for Wednesday. This is Rita Langland, your host from Hidden with Christ Ministries. Today, I want to speak with you about the importance of hearing and obeying the voice of God. We live in a generation when time seems to be just rushing forward, pressures on every side on people's lives, and the import of being able to discern the voice of God in the midst of a million voices trying to influence your life could not be more vital than this very moment that we're living in. I want to begin by simply sharing a story, a true story that was given as a testimony of a man who was in a small plane when the pilot collapsed and completely passed out, leaving himself and the one other passenger in an absolutely life and death situation. The gentleman was a lawyer and his fellow passenger also an attorney. And they were in a small plane flying back from a meeting where they were doing some legal work on a lawsuit, but they were in a very remote area of the Aleutian Islands in the state of Alaska in the United States. They had gotten into this small plane with someone they knew who was the pilot, and they were embarking on a journey back to the city of Anchorage, Alaska, where there's a large airport. In the course of flying, and it hadn't been very long that they were up in the air, the pilot passed out. They could not revive him. The gentleman that I'm going to tell you about was sitting next to the pilot, and the second passenger was sitting behind him in this small plane. Neither one of those passengers had any experience piloting a plane. They had no idea what to do, and they knew without the pilot they would surely perish. The gentleman in the front seat handed the radio back to the gentleman behind him and said, "Call out and see if you can get a hold of something, and I'm going to try to figure out what to do." So he began to call, trying to connect with anyone whom he could tell them they were in an emergency situation. Finally, someone actually came on that radio saying that he was also a pilot and he was flying through the area. They explained their situation. The pilot is passed out, unconscious. They can't revive him. What should they do? That pilot on the other plane, who was flying a very large aircraft on his way to Japan, was able to contact the Anchorage air traffic controllers, and they put someone on the radio who was able to begin to direct those two men who didn't know how to fly a plane, how to get themselves all the way back to Anchorage, which is over 2 hours from the place they were currently flying. One of the big problems was that they were about to enter stormy weather. In fact, clouds had encompassed the plane, and they literally couldn't see where they were, whether they're flying up, down, sideways. They couldn't tell because it was completely clouded by the storm clouds that they had entered into. And it was beginning to thunder and lightning, and it was a very dangerous situation. The gentleman who was in the front seat next to the pilot was a very strong Christian. Of course, he prayed, and he began to speak to the gentleman at the Anchorage airport who said to him some very critical words, which I want you to take to heart for your own life. That man said to him, "You cannot see me, but I can see you." He could see him on the radar. "You don't know where you are, but I know where you are. If you will listen to my voice and obey everything I tell you, I will get you home safely. But if you will not obey my voice, you will surely die." The man was very straight with him. It was a life and death situation. Think about your own life. You can't see God, but he can see you. You may think you can't hear his voice, but he hears every prayer that you're praying. He knows exactly where you are, and he knows exactly what you need. If you listen to his voice, he will take you through whatever you are experiencing right now. Those two men were in the middle of a storm in a small plane, being buffeted by wind, and didn't know how to fly that airplane. But the voice that they could hear over that radio told them, if you will obey my voice, I will get you home safely. If you do not obey my voice and you do something you think looks right because it feels right to you, you will die. The gentleman on the other end of that radio was going to give him step-by-step instructions how to fly that plane by instruments, meaning not by what you see, but by what knowledge he had of how to get that plane safely back to the airport. Step by step, he guided them. And those words kept coming to his mind. If you'll obey my voice, I will get you home safely. If you do not obey, you will surely die. That exact situation is what we are all facing in our lives today. If we can obey, hear and obey the voice of God, he will take you through every difficulty in a safe way and get you home, so to speak, safely. The hours went by. They were still aloft. They were making their progress, good progress toward the Anchorage airport. And then the voice on the other side of that radio said to him, you're doing great. You're getting closer to the airport. But listen, as you get closer, you're going to see lights on our runway, and they're in the shape of a cross. You need to line yourself up with the cross, and you'll be able to land safely. Think about that. Think about your life. Line it up with the cross. There's one who died for you. There's one who took everything upon his own body so that you could be healed, so that you could be free, so that you could be out of bondage to any kind of addiction, so that you don't have to go to hell when you die, but instead to heaven. Line yourself up with the cross, and you'll come home safely. And by the way, those two men who listened to that voice, obeyed the directions exactly, and lined themselves up with that cross, they landed safely and were miraculously saved. But let's get back to that issue of just hearing and obeying the voice of God. In your life, God wants you to be able to listen for his voice and then do what he says. You may say, I don't know how to hear the voice of God. Well, thank God he's more than willing to teach you. And he promised us that we are able. In the chapter 10 of the book of John, the Gospel of John, Jesus talked about himself as being the shepherd, and he also talked about his sheep being able to hear his voice. In fact, in John 10:27, he specifically says it that way. My sheep hear my voice. If you have given your life to Christ, you're one of his sheep. It means you are able to hear the voice of God. Yes, it takes practice to listen, it takes practice to hear and discern, and then it takes practice to walk that out by faith and then see what God does. Nobody learns to hear the voice of God instantly or like you hear it audibly necessarily, but he communicates to you in your spirit, man, and you have to become sensitive in your spirit to God's voice. We live in a very fleshly world, so everything that people are often guided by have to do with the flesh, how they feel. I feel hungry, I feel scared, whatever. But God is not communicating to you through your flesh. He's communicating to you through your spirit. And you're going to have to work on becoming sensitive. And one of the ways you do that is by reading his word, spending time in prayer, and it'll begin to develop your spirit. The next time we're together, I'm going to talk more about how to develop hearing the voice of God and what will hinder you from hearing God's voice. But today, I just want to make this single point. You've got to learn how to hear his voice and then obey it, or you will surely perish. We have to have this area of our life develop so that we can live and not die. I'll end with one more story that illustrates that point very well. In the course of my life of walking with God more than 40 years, I've read many biographies of Christians because I wanted to know how to walk with God in a way that would be significant in my own life and help other people. And I was reading one story about a missionary family who were in Southeast Asia. They were driving in their vehicle on one afternoon, and the father of the family was the driver. And as he drove down this mountainous road with basically a cliff on the one side and the mountain on the other, very narrow 2-lane road, but barely 2 lanes, all of a sudden he was coming near to a curve, and he heard in his spirit so strong, veer left quickly, veer left quickly. And he's like, if I veer left, I'll be on the mountain. It didn't make sense, and the oncoming traffic would be on that. And if someone's coming around that curve, they'd be on the other side. He'd go into their lane and potentially have a collision. But it got more intense and more intense until finally he couldn't stand it because he knew the voice of God. He veered hard left up against the mountain. Seconds later, a massive truck came tearing around the corner in the lane he had just left. Had he been there, it would have thrown him off the mountainside. You have to be able to hear the voice of God, or you will surely perish. That is the lesson that was so clear in their life experience that day. But it's true for you. It's true for me. We have to hear his voice, obey his voice, so that we will live and not die. And also be able to be used by God in amazing ways in this earth where so many are in need of a word of encouragement and the truth that they might live and not die. Let's develop our hearing ear to hear God's voice and hear it and obey it, and we will surely live. Join me next week on Word for Wednesday. We'll talk about how to hear the voice of God and also what will hinder us from hearing his voice. Thanks for being with me today. Listen carefully and then obey.